Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Sunday stream on this fine 20th of March, 2022. I hope that everyone is having a very good Sunday so far, wherever you are at. Hello to everyone. And as we have the people start rolling in and get things started, we are going to have quite a bit to talk about today. So, as if you noticed in the description, we'll be talking about arms, alliances, rapprochements, and sort of again more second order effects from the ongoing crisis that in war that is going on in Ukraine. So, as I've mentioned already, we're avoiding more or less the direct day by day conflict. I don't want to be reporting on sort of the agitprop, the propaganda, and the fog of war. So, we're going to do what we can do, which is take a look at the second order impacts and effects. And that's exactly what we're going to do today. We're going to continue our conversation from last week. And that's exactly what I have in mind for you all today. I was promised, or I was asked at the very beginning to just sort of make a comment about Bono in his poem. It's an insult to St. Patrick and an insult to the rest of Ireland, and we should ignore it. So that's exactly what's going to be happening. So we'll talk a little bit more about our various addresses to Congress and to the Parliament later on today. So an outline for today's discussion. We're going to sort of continue from last week because I thought that there was definitely something there that was worth addressing, which was about wheat. We talked about the increase of wheat prices, and we talked about Egypt and Ethiopia, but there was a lot more about this that I was doing more research on shortly after the stream because someone had sent me a link. So we're going to talk about what this means for foreign aid and specifically the World Food Program. So there'll be a lot there to talk about in regards to the United Nations. We'll sort of start talking a lot about India and then the impact that arms sales has on sort of diplomacy in this area. And then, of course, we'll take a look at how this conflict and the discussion of NATO has also brought upon other countries to start having meetings and discussing rapprochement with one another as to avoid other crises at the same time. And then finally, we'll sort of wrap this up with some of the rumblings that have been coming out from peace talks and who are some of the major players involved in that area. So there's a lot going on to talk about. And then, of course, at the very end, announcements and frog of the week. So hopefully this will be a little bit longer than last time, but hopefully just as engaging. So with my coffee at my side, it's a great appetite suppressant for those of you trying to undergo Lent. I might give that up next year instead of what I gave up this year, which was fast food, but who knows. So let's begin today's discussion. I thought that'd be better to call them discussions than lectures. So, as we talked about last week to begin, was the subject of wheat prices and the impact that it is going to have on those who are already high importers of wheat and agricultural products. And we had mentioned specifically that one of the largest importers of Russian wheat was that of Egypt, and what potential disaster that could be, forecasting some issues within the Horn of Africa. And that is an area that we will be covering in the near future, and more on that in the later. But I found this wonderful graphic on Twitter from some international relations scholars that have been making the rounds, and I'll talk about it in just a second on my take from it. But as you can tell, there is significant African dependency from both Russia and Ukraine on the subject of wheat imports and the World Food Program, which provides everything from sunflower oil to, of course, food, wheat, grains, granola, everything that you could possibly imagine in order to make sure that famines don't break out across the Western or across the developing world. And as this graphic on the left will show you, there are significant impacts that this can have. So the lines in red here are talking about wheat that comes from Russia, and blue that comes from Ukraine. Now, there are a few prominent countries that are definitely worth taking a look at here. One is in the Horn of Africa that I think is worth noticing, and then the other one is more so on the near the Mediterranean coastline. The first one I wanted to notice was the one way down at the bottom, who gets a majority of their wheat imports from both Russia and Ukraine. But the blue line is the biggest, and that, of course, is the basket case that is Somalia. So again, we will definitely be seeing a significant second order impact from this war, due to the fact that these areas of agriculture aren't going to be exporting as much anymore, especially from Ukraine. That will take a point in here. Actually, news statements from the World Food Program via the United Nations says, on top of already existing high prices and supply chain issues, the ongoing war in Ukraine between these two nations is demonstrative of the fact that international aid programs are incredibly fragile. So a major takeaway to take from this is that any system of foreign aid that is reliant upon, NGOs is the better way to take a look at this. NGOs, non-governmental organizations like the United Nations, like the World Food Program, are going to be incredibly fragile in the midst of crises, especially with agricultural states going to war with one another. And again, this is 30% of all of the world's wheat exports come from Russia and Ukraine. Well, we're talking about almost now a third here, which is quite a bit to deal with. So you're looking now at about, what's the population of Africa? I know it's well over 1 point something billion, the whole continent. Population of the African continent. 1.26 billion people as of estimates from 2016. So, considering that some of these are the most populous countries listed on here, including South Africa, Tunisia, Somalia, I mean, most of Africa is on this list in terms of countries. Things to, keep in mind. Now, the ones that I wanted to highlight were, of course, Somalia, South Africa, and Tunisia. South Africa, because this is already a country that is dealing with substantial farming issues, whether it's farm murders or the simple fact that supply lines from the government to distribute water and electricity are already dealing with regular rolling blackouts, and the fact that they are dependent upon Russian wheat and those kind of imports. You can already see why nations like South Africa had voted in abstention with the recent United Nations meeting to condemn Russia's actions in Ukraine. The second one, also with a large blue bar rather than the red, was that of Tunisia. Now, Tunisia is considered to be one of the quote unquote successes of the Arab Spring as it began to formulate a successful democracy, or at the very least have the semblance of one. And the level of success, of course, is dubious within North African states. Not to mention, it borders right next to Libya, which again is right next to them on this lovely graphic here, that are also significantly dependent upon Ukrainian wheat imports. So we can kind of clearly prognosticate that if you add supply chain issues, increasing prices of fertilizer, on top of the fact that just the sheer amount of prices to get things imported, fuel, energy costs, shipping costs, port and transit fees, on top of what's been more or less a sort of this malaise of inflation that's not just affecting the Western world, then yeah, we're going to see the situation in Libya, which is a failed state, known for trafficking, known for harboring terrorist organizations, hated by both Iran and the United States. Right there next to, both Tunisia and other parts of the Middle East that have the potential to make life in sub-Saharan Africa that much worse. So where you can tell is the major takeaway is that, failed states that are heavily dependent upon these food programs will see an exacerbation of terrorism. Secondly, that we know that non-governmental organizations dependent upon nations and their agricultural exports are significantly fragile to conflict as well as sanctions policy. And it does have the capacity to exacerbate them. I mentioned Libya, but Ethiopia is also a major recipient, not just of Ukrainian wheat, but also Ukrainian sunflower oil as well for cooking and machinery. So, this is something that I had tweeted out earlier this week when I saw this graphic, and I think Mark had popped out on this in the chat. Was I kind of recalled a little quip from the climate czar of former Secretary of State John Kerry, saying that we really haven't seen anything yet when it comes to migrants or refugee crises until you get climate refugees, and there are about 1 million of them at your doorstep, either due to inhospitable land or due to flooding or salinized riverways. Now, I just couldn't help but think to myself on that issue. And that's why I tweeted about it. I said it would be a shame about all these climate refugees coming due to climate change to other countries, when clearly we can see that the system is heavily dependent upon the World Food Program and these other countries. And Mark has linked it in the chat. So that's definitely something to keep in mind there. That you might have just sort of this artificially induced Camp of the Saints situation. But on top of just what's happening in Africa with the World Food Program, the World Food Program is also operating an emergency mission into Ukraine to deliver food. So it's not necessarily the infamous blue helmets, but the United Nations is operating an emergency food program response in Ukraine. Most recently, they've been asking for ceasefires, and they've been asking for, these humanitarian corridors to get food. They've noticed that encircled cities are basically a food desert because there's no aspect for them to get access to clean water or food, given that services are out and there's no agriculture. So primarily, the United Nations has been putting a significant focus of its a Ukrainian emergency food program inside of Mariupol. The current city, I believe, is encircled by the Russians, and I think that's where the Azov Battalion is fighting. So, something to definitely keep in mind in that issue here. So, again, the big takeaway out of this is just that of these second order effects, we know that these countries like Egypt do have substantial reserves of wheat, at least for 8 months or so. Um, when at the same time, they will eventually have to deal with the planting issues, and they will definitely have to deal with the problem of how are they going to continue to grow or import them from other countries, and they'll have to bid for them. But now there's this question from King of Games. I'm going to put it on screen here because this is a question I've addressed before. He asked, why is Africa so dependent on Ukrainian wheat when Egypt used to feed the entirety of the Western Roman Empire? How does this make sense? And that's a good question, King of Games, and we can give you some answers to it. So, yes, Egypt was once famously the breadbasket of Rome and its ability to grow food and whatnot. The Nile River of the Roman Empire, one, is not the same as before. Two, the government management of the Nile River has been substantially poor since the 1960s. Thirdly, the current government, with Al-Sisi and others, have been trying to cut down on embankments and illegal irrigation, and they're not going for it. And as someone jokingly also says, point four can be that they're no longer organized by the Romans. But the other thing to keep in mind, right, is that they've been substantially using these imports to make up for the fact that other crops are just cheaper to grow. So you're kind of playing the old comparative advantage game when it comes to economics on that issue. So right now, one of the big issues that we talked about a couple of months back when we were talking about the dam in Ethiopia is that Egypt has this ongoing crisis of where, one, they're having poor management of the river. Two, their crops that are being made are not foodstuffs. They're growing cotton. They're not growing wheat or other major foodstuffs that you would need to feed a large population. And then three, and this is something that the president had noted when he went to the United Nations not too long ago, was that the Nile River Delta has seen increased levels of salinization. Whether that's poor management, whether that's due to climate change is debatable, but these are issues that Egypt is facing on top of just vastly poor organization. And then this is all coming across the fact that fertilizer costs have shipped through the roof. Last week, we talked about that with wheat prices. And now, as someone points out, we are the remnants. In the UK, fertilizer has gone from 80 pounds a ton to 1,000 pounds a ton. So those are all things to keep in mind there as to why Egypt is not doing so well in its growth of its own agricultural sectors to feed its populations. And that's something to keep in mind. Some compare it to the Aral Sea, others compare it to poor government management. It's a mix of all things. But as Walrus jokingly states in the chat, Lent in 2023 is going to be off the wall for Asiatic, Coptic, and all other Christians in that area. So plenty of things that will happen in the near future. Because again, We may not see the immediate impact of this until it comes time to plant or to buy more, and prices are still through the roof, either A, due to sanctions, B, speculation, and three, poor management of resources from these governments. So all bets are off on what could potentially happen. But my prognostication on this, and I'm typically not one to make predictions, is that we will see crisis and conflict over food and over wheat in Africa, whether it's sub-Saharan Africa, Central Africa, the already ongoing conflicts that are happening, whether it's within Sudan, whether it's within Ethiopia, whether it's with the issues of counterterrorism efforts in the Central African Republic or the Democratic Republic of Congo. Those things are all going to explode. And I mean, that's just going to be something to keep there. And as our resident Egyptian has brought a good point here, Egypt is now trying to convert 1.5 million acres of desert now. So desertification is a substantial piece of work here. And so you've got hundreds of millions of people. I mean, a continent of a population of like 1.26 billion that could be potentially embroiled in global crises very soon. And that's something that we should be paying very close attention to in the years ahead. So that's just one thing that I wanted to touch base on from our conversation last week when we talked about wheat prices, because I didn't even begin to think about how this is going to affect foreign aid. Um, and as we can tell, when it's from a national government that has the capacity, and you can make this as sort of an argument for like nations rather than the NGO, is that obviously U.S. aid, right, the American sort of aspect of international aid and its foreign policy, isn't going to be affected by this because it's not dependent upon um, that issue. It's not dependent upon being reliant on donations or imports from other countries. So that will be something to definitely keep in mind. So one thing there to say. And see, the other question that also is being brought up in chat, and I kind of want to address it here. Is this a way for the U.S. to combat Chinese influence in Africa through food diplomacy, since it has the capacity to produce food? This is potential to be the case. One thing that a lot of China's investments right within Africa has been primarily telecommunications, infrastructure, and then of course natural resource extraction. So rare earth minerals, technological like recycling that happens a lot there. There's a huge problem of e-waste in within Africa, and then but I mean, they're not using food as necessarily as much as the United States is, nor are they using, say, what we've been doing since the Bush administration, which is PEPFAR, which is the anti-HIV policy. So those are potential areas in which the regime could, or the United States and its government, could fight in Africa, not just through counterterrorism like it has historically done, but it could do so through the lens that hey, we have food, we have production. Whereas I don't know the entire state of China's food foreign aid, but that would be an interesting thing to look at in the future. But that is a potential avenue, yes. So we are now dealing with real deserts and food deserts in the near future. And for those of you just tuning in, we're only on the first slide. We're just talking about food programs. We're about 20 minutes in. So, in the midst of this sanctions regime, the other thing to keep in mind is that we have tense relations with what the United States is pursuing in Asia in comparison to what other major countries are pursuing on their own path. And I wanted to focus explicitly on Russia-Indian relations. And I have the lovely image of Putin and Narendra Modi just sort of embracing and shaking hands. It kind of reminds me of the old friendship has ended with so and so. This guy is my new friend. The memes just write themselves, don't they? But at the recent United Nations meeting in regards to Russia and being condemned, while there was overall substantial condemnation, there were significant numbers of abstentions, and India was one of 35. So that's something to definitely keep in mind. And we have our little buddy cop movie here on the right. But amidst these Western led sanctions on oil, the Wall Street Journal was reporting just earlier this morning that India is actually moving in the other direction. And they're going towards a closer relationship with Russian oil and natural gas and having an increased level of energy production and import from Russia. So moving in that direction. And Russia has already reassured India that any sanctions from the West, primarily the United States, will not impact their ongoing deals, whether it is in energy or security. So down below, you'll notice that in 2018, India had decided to procure the S-400 missile system in order for its own national defense to be strengthened. And we'll talk about that more in just a second when we take a look at the impact that arms deals has. But it is a substantial issue that was dealing both with the Trump administration and now the Biden administration. However, the wonderful U.S. administration decided to discuss the idea of placing sanctions on the Indian government and the Indian people, specifically members within Narendra Modi in the parliament, to make sure that they got the message to stay on board with Russian sanctions and what the U.S. is doing. But there has been substantial pushback. There have been members of parliament and there have been members of the government there that illustrate that they're not going to be pushed around by the United States, that India will pursue its own interests in this area. Now, this, of course, comes at the counterbalance, right? That there's this pressure on the geostrategic interests inside Ukraine, but at the same time, the United States is still ongoing with its pivot to Asia moment in 2011 until present day, so over 10 years now. And of course, this includes the Quad, which is sort of this unofficial official organization that's meant to be a counterweight against China, focusing on Australia, Japan, the United States, and India. So this is going to be an issue wherein you're trying to increase cooperation and increase this sort of counterweight of these democratic states against China. But at the same time, you're dealing with this other issue halfway around the world, and you're threatening sanctions against someone that you want to have on your side. So yeah, imagine that. People don't like being lectured or ordered around, in sort of an exploitative fashion, of course. But this also illustrates the concern or the complaint that perhaps things are a bit overextended, or they maybe have pushed their hand too far on this specific issue. When you're aiming for, again, one issue in Europe, it's not going to have the same impact when you're looking across to the Asiatic regions when, oh, by the way, you still have a significant majority of your, what's the word I'm looking for? A majority of your carrier strike groups are still in the Asiatic region. I think you have one in the North Sea and one near the Strait of Gibraltar, the last I checked, but that's about it, right? And that's where we're at in this instance. And so, again, it illustrates that you cannot have a uniform policy, or that or your influences are not as strong as you once thought that they were. Specifically, when you are dealing with some of the most important parts of countries, which is securitization and energy. And if you're trying to make it harder for you as a nation state in the world of great power politics to accomplish that, then it's going to be very, very rough for you to have a working relationship with this country, especially for what has always been lauded by the West as the world's most populous democracy. And I can't help but laugh. I'm just going to do this as an aside. I love the fact that someone named DB Cooper is wondering where the hell has he been. um, but here we go. So on top of these tense relationships with India, you can kind of also tell what impact this is going to have on arms sales and the impact it will have on relations between Russia and other nation states. So this came out earlier this year, I think in January, from Statista, which is a great resource if you're looking to understand, just get stats and trying to interpret them. So alongside the Russian sanctions push, the United States has had an arms embargo on Russia, something that Obama's administration had done, and something that the Biden administration has recently done, I believe, since he took office, and to make ammunition more expensive for the Americans. But at the same time, we also have to examine how arms imports and arms sales to other countries are going to impact their relationship to the United States and this ongoing situation in Ukraine with Russia. So, alongside the Russian sanctions push, arms sales are definitely the biggest indicator of sort of their strategic interests and their relationships with other countries. So what I do have here on the right is this great image, and you can tell that the three largest importing countries of Russian arms from 2017 to 2021 are the following: India, China, and Egypt. The rest are various Asiatic countries or either one of the former Soviet republics and, of course, nations inside the Middle East. But you'll notice at the very, very far end, there's Turkey at 1.4%. We'll touch base on that in a second here. Turkey, despite its close relationships with the U.S., while it's on the hostile nations list, what I meant to, this is a slight error, I mean that to be Egypt. Egypt, despite its close relationship with the U.S. with foreign aid and diplomacy, was not listed on the hostile nations list. Turkey is, because Turkey is a member of NATO. I just wanted to clarify my own little error here I'm noticing. But both India and Egypt are some of the world's largest arms importers, between that of Russian arms. So you can kind of tell where their goose is cooked, so to speak, in their relationship with Russia. Ongoing negotiations between the Egyptian government and the Russians, particularly between the two foreign ministers. Sergei Lavrov has said that they will work within all means possible to ensure that their arms are available in order to get there. And then secondly is the issue of course, like we mentioned, India. Egypt has not procured the S-400 missile systems and the ones that, follow within this line, the S-300 and the S-500 that are being planned. But Turkey has purchased the S-400, and so has India. So you can tell that these sanctions pushes from the West are going to have a significant impact on the state interests of security. So those are definitely things to keep in mind, especially when we examine. Not only do they want an arms embargo, again, like as Charlemagne put in his Substack, we still don't know yet the fullest extent of what these, what's the word I'm looking for? What the impact of these sanctions are going to be. We do know about the SWIFT system. We do know about freezing assets. There's been great conversation about seizing buildings, yachts, apartments, etc. But we will not know yet to the fullest extent there. And that's something that we'll be taking a look at. But at the same time, this also shows the leverage about American policy regarding arms. So, for instance, when Turkey had purchased the S-400 missile systems from the Russians, the United States immediately took off Turkey from the list of commerce or nations to trade with for the F-35 export program. Now, this has not happened with nations that we're currently negotiating with that, or have that import arms, but we haven't considered giving India nor Egypt the F-35 either. And as Mr. Fauzi tells us here in the chat, that the U.S. has finally agreed to start negotiations concerning the F-15 Fighting Eagle. They've been trying to get that for more than 10 years, he says. So, again, it sort of illustrates the differences, one, between the bureaucracy of how American weapons export starts, and then the fact that, we can get them closer and cheaper elsewhere, in this instance, Russia. So definitely something to keep in mind in the future is that if you want a good idea of where one's strategic relationship is, not only should you be looking at arms, yes, arms, but you shouldn't be just looking at naval exercises. You shouldn't be looking at joint defense agreements, border agreements, training exercises. You should also be looking at arms sales. Arms sales are going to be a very good indicator as to how these smaller nations engage in the world of great power politics between the United States, Russia, and China. This is all happening. And while Turkey has procured the S-400 missile system, Turkey is also trying to expand its own military capabilities and not be so reliant on NATO countries and armament exports. So we'll definitely talk a lot about that in the future. And that's something that also is to point out, right, is that the Americans make their weapons interoperable with others. That's why we have NATO-specific ammunition, and I mean, we monopolize arms. I think someone just pointed that out in the chat that's definitely something that they're going for. But yeah, there's definitely a lot here to keep in mind. But I mean, let's see. This is just, again, a showing of potential areas for diplomatic means. I mean, until they're actually buying weapons, until they're actually putting out things on paper, as long as it just stays there, it's not going to do anything. And if we kind of tell from, the West, like the Budapest Memorandum of 1995 or 94, that sometimes not everything on paper is going to be a good sign, but the actual purchasing of goods, the actual training, the actual sharing of intelligence or equipment is a good sign. And the fact that we're buying this equipment is indicative of where things are going. But this puts NATO back in the spotlight, of course, since there's been so much talk about no-fly zones, NATO equipment, shipping in NATO, NATO-like weapons. By that, I mean U.S., all of that sort of interoperable between militaries of the alliance into Ukraine. Um, Not too long ago, I had began to have this discussion, or at least this thought experiment in my mind, that sort of these large umbrellas, whether it's the European Union or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, OTAN, how well they can effectively keep nations working in cooperation with one another while you have these, centuries, if not millennia old flashpoints bubbling up underneath the surface. And last year, when I had talked about this, it was the discussion over the fact that the Greek military had recently purchased submarines and Rafale fighter aircraft from the French in order to update and upgrade its navy and its armed services, or armed forces and its armed services, against the Turks that have a recently renovated fleet, more modern equipment, and have a stronger naval presence than that of the Greek navy. And I said at the same time, some of the equipment that Turkey uses for anti submarine technology and detection is bought from the Germans. And it's kind of interesting that you're seeing this Franco German rivalry in the background, not just between the arms, but also for control and push for, say, European Union political leadership and the idea of a European Union army, all while at the same time, these age old issues over Cyprus and the, of course, long-standing issues between Turkey and Greece are now being propped up by these sort of bilateral agreements as well. So definitely something to keep in mind when I say this in the background. And my thought process was at the time that, I don't know how sustainable that relationship can be with these large alliances when underneath the surface, all of these countries are going for bilateral defense agreements and bilateral, pacts about arms sales, equipment, and exercises. And then, while all at the same time, right, they have to and go through joint NATO exercises. And I thought, as things continue to get tense over these issues, how long that might potentially last. And well, I kind of had this partially answered that perhaps that this could be um, in peacetime, these things bubble up, but when there is somewhat of an international crisis upon the continent, that things might change. So at the very beginning, I think it was Minoan who was asking, who are the two gentlemen that were pictured on the thumbnail? And that was Turkish President Erdogan with the recent Greek Prime Minister Mitsotakis. And they had recently met just last week, last Sunday, to talk about NATO and to talk about cooperation and rapprochement in diplomatic matters in the wake of the crisis. And the major takeaway from this conversation was the subject of how can we increase our relationship, and then secondly, we're both NATO countries. We should be focusing on the bigger issue at hand, which is making sure that this doesn't escalate into a conflict between the CSTO and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So there was a lot of focus on cooperation. And when it came up to the discussion over Cyprus, they had both agreed that there needs to be more negotiation and more meetings on the issue. And they had said, quote, a new crisis would not be welcomed at this time in the wake of Ukraine and Russia. So it does kind of illustrate the importance that Turkey has, not only geographically but also geostrategically. It's of course very close to Russia in the purchasing of equipment, but at the same time it also antagonizes Russia for its own national security interests. We've kind of been able to see that with Kazakhstan, the conflict in Armenia and Azerbaijan, and now most recently the development and the procurement of their own TB2 UAV equipment from the Ukrainians, and they've talked about having joint production in both Ukraine and Turkey. But I thought that this was a particularly important meeting, especially because it illustrates that not only is Turkey going to be important, and we'll talk about that in the next slide, but also just how strong these institutions can be to increase mediation when dealing with a foe. So while I am not the biggest proponent that perhaps NATO has a purpose, the counter argument that I'm beginning to see ferment is that perhaps it would be this, a way to facilitate issues if you can present that. I guess would be perhaps the liberal or the neo-functionalist argument for sure. Um, but out of this, it was a pleasure to see Greece and Turkey, longstanding issues, and meet. And at the same time, right, it was nice to see someone who's a member of the Greek Orthodox Church and that of the president of a majority Muslim country also meet as well. So things to definitely keep in mind here. But Turkey, of course, is pushing out and seeking uh, its own interests. So things to keep in mind. And as we've talked about in the past, it's going to be Turkey that we need to be paying attention to. So, not only was the Greek Turkish meeting a signal of geostrategic importance and diplomatic rapprochement, but countries that have not had the world's strongest relationship with one another are also beginning to see signs of rapprochement. Not too long ago, did France send a special envoy of its foreign ministry to talk to Turkey to discuss issues ranging from everything such as Islamophobia and migration, integration, and furthermore, and most importantly, the situation in Ukraine. So Erdogan is kind of playing the wild card here in his ability to leverage European interests and needs against its own foreign policy ambitions. In the West, there's been a lot of analysis saying that Turkey is sort of isolating itself across the board. It's getting involved in Armenia and Azerbaijan against the Russians, and they're doing things in Kazakhstan, and of course, they're ongoingly fighting Kurdish fighters inside northern Syria, despite American and Western protests about killing the Kurds. And at the same time, its relationship with Israel has not been so strong. And it's something very interesting to keep in mind because Turkey is wishing to seek out its own military and its own foreign policy initiatives. So, despite its relationship with, say, NATO or Russia, this country does have its own geopolitical ambitions, and it recognizes that geostrategic importance of where it is dealing with the Mediterranean, the Black Sea, and the Dardanelles Strait. And so we'll talk about that in just a minute. But Turkey continues to play this significant role in regional diplomacy. Like I mentioned with the issue of France, it's leveraging these political and socio-cultural issues to get, greater cooperation, the idea of sharing more intelligence, being more updated about the state of diplomacy, and pushing itself outwards despite being a part of NATO and despite having its relationship with, say, Russia and China. So that's something to show that Turkey is going to be the linchpin, I think, in the future when it comes to ending this crisis. That, again, alongside with, say, France and Greece, there has also been Israeli and Turkish rapprochement. So earlier this month, President Erdogan received in Ankara Israeli President Herzog. Now, the Israeli president, of course, doesn't seem to, of course, hold a lot of power. We know that it's within the prime minister, and that's Mr. Bennett. But this is a significant change in the diplomacy between Turkey and Israel. There has not been a Israeli president visiting Turkey in 15 years until earlier this month. So it's Turkey's beginning to sort of play out leverage here. And considering the relationship that Israel has with both Russia and Ukraine and Turkey's own presence here, it's important for them to engage in this relationship. And the fact that these two nations are having rapprochement, especially because Turkey has historically supported Hamas and they want to increase this position. So there's a lot there to have happen. And of course, these two countries are playing a vital role in the mediation process between the Ukrainian and Russian governments. But I do have this image on the right regarding their fleet and sort of their carrier fleet for merchant marine and things like that in 2020. And things, of course, have substantially changed since 2020. And what has been changing is not only has Russia been decreasing armament imports from, say, Russia, but they're also trying to be less dependent upon NATO as well. This is specifically because Turkey, under Erdogan, has been pushing for a more independent navy, or a more independent navy, but a more independent military writ large. So um, I'm quite interested in seeing how this is going, because they've recently managed to procure South Korean engines for their own domestically built tanks, named after a Turkish general. Its name escapes me. I think Atali, if I'm remembering the article correctly. But they're trying to be less dependent upon the Americans. They're trying to be less dependent upon the Germans. They tried to get German engines, and that didn't work out successfully. And they're now moving towards a more independent military with independently produced vehicles and independently produced equipment for their own national defense, and potentially later in the future for export. So Turkey, again, is in the spotlight, both diplomatically and strategically, because while the West may say that, oh, by the way, Turkey is isolating itself from the world, it is also something to keep in mind in regards to the fact that Turkey has its own geopolitical ambitions. And one thing that was done without necessarily a lot of, from my understanding, with a lot of consultation, was earlier this month, is the invocation of the Montreux Convention. So for those of you who are unfamiliar, the Montreux Convention is an old document governing the Dardanelles, and it's the running straits question into the Black Sea. And it gives Turkey more or less the ability to govern this area. So there have been controversies about it, but the terms of it, and this comes back in 1936, but of course it says dealing with Greek demilitarization, and then the demilitarization of the Dardanelles, the Sea of Marmara, and the Bosphorus, and of course, I believe 3 Turkish islands. It has 29 articles and a few protocols, but there are quite a bit about military passage, and that's kind of what the biggest thing is. So I believe it was at the end of February that was what they did this. The Ukrainian government under Zelensky had requested that it exercised its authority under this convention to limit the transit of Russian warships from the Mediterranean into the Black Sea. And prior to the invasion, there were quite a few warships and submarines that were already in the Black Sea. There was some reluctance, given that the country was close to Ukraine and Russia for obvious reasons. The Turkish foreign minister, Cavusoglu, I'm sure I'm butchering that. I'm not Turkish. Melvut is definitely, I think, his first name, or Melvlat. And he said that their government would recognize the Russian invasion as a war and invoke the grounds of convention. Because if there's a war, then Turkey has the capacity to close the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles Straits and settle the Straits question, to where no other military ships can come in. The Dardanelles, excuse me, can all come in and ensure that no military craft can come in. Now, they are allowed to leave and go back to their respective bases. But to me, this is not necessarily a sign of escalation, but also a great way to tell the West to not come here. Do not bring your navy. Do not bring, submarines or equipment. And there you go. And I'm sure everyone in the chat and the comments is probably butchering my pronunciation of things, and do forgive me. I will improve in the future with that. But this invocation of the Montreux Convention is indicative that they're sort of putting their foot out there, and they're trying and de-escalate the position. And so as we get now near to the end, I just wanted to bring up some of the rumblings I've heard about peace negotiations and peace talks. So this is your beloved section on rank punditry, everybody. So despite the current fighting and potential word of advances into Mariupol, Odessa, and as the Institute for the Study of War tells us, this encircling around Kiev, the city seems to be its own salient now, at least from the northeast. Turkey, Switzerland, and Israel have all now tried to make attempts to host talks and mediate. So all 3 of these nations have tried, and I think this is some of the bigger reasons as to why Israel and Turkey are seeing rapprochement, because both of these nations do have a substantial relationship with Russia as well as Ukraine. Ukraine for a little more obvious reasons than, say, Russia, but both of these countries do have a strong relationship with Ukraine and Russia. And most recently, despite the sanctions and this so-called ending of its neutrality, let's face it, Switzerland has never been neutral. Just doesn't really go to war, but it does play the financial game very well. The Swiss president earlier today had announced that the nation of Switzerland is ready to host talks and try and host peace negotiations. This did come at Zelensky's request that Switzerland host peace talks, so take that with a grain of salt. However, Financial Times earlier this week had given a report saying that there are about 15 points that they're trying to negotiate between the Ukrainians and the Russians. Primarily, the sticking point has been about demilitarization, specifically along the lines that Russia wants Ukraine to demilitarize. Ukraine is willing to maintain its own military force, but it will not allow any foreign military bases, and it will not join NATO or by extension, really any other Western security agreement unless it's bilateral. So those are, again, some things that are being floated around. But again, Turkey, Israel, and now Switzerland have all joined the fray trying to mediate or negotiate. Prime Minister Bennett of Israel has met with President Putin and has made phone calls with President Zelensky, and President Erdogan is also making the rounds, speaking with President Putin as well as Zelensky later this week. So there's a lot of rumblings going on. This is the more speculative part because we never really know how these things go or how they end. But allegedly, there are talks on the table, and they have tried before. We kind of have those wonderful images of, the Ukrainian side not really taking it seriously in the matter of how they dress or having their phones out or ball caps. But who knows what might happen? And of course, the real question is what world leader gives away their own territory? And their Ukrainians are asking for the Russians to leave, period, and sort of move these things all out. Finishing that coffee. It had gotten cold. But I mean, these are the things that are currently going on. So you do have three various interested parties that are involved in this talking process, and obviously the three of them have some interest. One is financial, because Switzerland has received a lot of capital flight from Russia prior to the invasion. Edward Slavsquat on Substack, he's a really great independent writer and journalist who does a lot of good work sort of examining a lot of the Russian financial side and sort of the politics behind it. He's been doing really good work on that, and that's who I've been relying on for that. So that, of course, Switzerland has an interest because there's a lot of oligarch money there and gold. Secondly, of course, Turkey wants to see this mediated. They have a close relationship between the two countries, and of course, their geostrategic importance, and Israel as well, because both Ukraine and Russia do have a very strong relationship with both countries. I'm going to let you all have that out in the chat for whatever you want to read that into. But it does pose some interesting questions. For instance, will anything come out of these? I think Russia's been pretty adamant in their goals. I mean, I think that most in this situation like this, you may want to achieve your military goals and keep the war going until you can get to a point where you have substantial leverage to either A, sue for peace, or B, accept some sort of terms for surrender. So I don't think that we're going to see any immediate ceasefire come out of these talks. I do think that we'll continue to see offenses and counteroffensives as both of these foreign leaders try and negotiate some kind of agreement. But alongside these rumblings, right, while Putin is saying that the military is going on course, that things are going just fine according to plan, Zelensky, of course, is pressuring the West for more arms and for more money. And I had tweeted this out earlier this week because I think AA's got his boomer truth regime down pat in his defense of the point versus others that may want to use a different paradigm. But for the old civic religion, right? It's always about World War II and the civil rights movement in the United States and other parts of the Western world that America's exported culturally. And when, of course, Zelensky gives his Zoom call to the parliament in the UK, he addresses, of course, and he ushers in Shakespeare, and he ushers in the cultural impact that Winston Churchill has as a wartime leader. And when he comes to the United States, he references World War II, he references the Day of Infamy, he references Pearl Harbor, but he also references Martin Luther King Jr. And he talks about having a dream, and that for Zelensky, his country has a need. So a little interesting difference between the two. But I do think for sure that this is a really good way to steel man the position of the boomer truth regime, as AA likes to call it, because lo and behold, we're talking about World War II and the civil rights movement. So sort of this like, you know, empire of lies regime, the gay, whatever you want to call it. They all, all of the greatest hits, so to speak, of its religious, canonical texts were being referenced by a foreign leader. So something I think that was just interesting as both of these countries try their best to put it out now. Um, and the other thing also, right, is that as long as more arms and come in for the Ukrainians, the longer that this can be stalled out. So we'll see how this goes. In in the long run of these things, it just kind of illustrates a lot of what's happening, and that unless we live there and on the ground. And I mentioned this, and you'll probably hear it later when the podcast comes out. But on the Fed post, I talked about that unless you're really on the ground, it's going to be very difficult to have a very firm understanding of what's actually going on the ground. And this is why, again, second order effects are the best way to do it, because we have no idea what will come from these talks. And we'll have no idea whether peace may come or if they'll continue to wage war until one can sue for peace or one has to surrender. While at the same time, the other issues in the background, right, is, well, China has announced giving arms and equipment to the Russians, to which the American government has said, that we'll fight back via sanctions or something else. To which sort of Xi Jinping had kind of just smiled and brushed it off. So we're seeing a lot sort of play all here in this role. But now, I think this kind of gives us towards the end of the lecture. I'm going to offer my final thoughts and prognostications. Um, so when we talk about de-dollarization and we talk about the shifting of potential alliances or these rapprochement between groups, these things may not be permanent. We may not know until for a very long time how long or how strong these relationships will be. If things are done merely on paper or we're merely ignoring phone calls, we have to be more reliant to examine action than just words. So this is something that I want everyone in the audience to keep in mind, because everyone wants to have a hot take. Everyone wants to say that this is the end of the gay, or this is the end of the petrodollar or whatnot. And I think that to invoke my channel's name just a bit, I think it would be prudent to see how the actions play out. I know that the Indians are buying Russian oil in the rupee, and they're not buying it through dollars, which is a sign that potentially we're seeing some more financial independence come from India and de-dollarization. While at the same time, for those of you who are a little more World Economic Forum minded about what's going on, there has been conversations in Ukraine about implementing certain kinds of digital identification and central bank digital currency. So some of those things on the horizon in 8 years about owning nothing and being happy in 2030. But we should, again, continue to see how these relationships and alliance shifts play out. But I think the ones that we should pay attention to the closest, that I think are far more immediate, are the 35 abstaining nations from the United Nations. Those include, of course, infamously the BRICS, whether that's Brazil, in its relationship to Russia, as we mentioned last week. They're reliant on Russian natural gas for the nitrogenation of their own fertilizer, for the soil, for their own agricultural sector. Egypt, of course, for arms imports and wheat imports. South Africa, obviously, for the same. Not so much for the armament deal, but they do have a strong trading relationship, especially in agriculture and energy. And then, of course, various other countries that have abstained, like India. So these things will continue to unfold, and we need to be paying attention to the actions. But I do think that the abstentions that are already there sort of illustrate the fault lines and sort of this Western-oriented alliance and its economic regime versus those that are independent and trying to break away. And this is sort of the vestiges of the Cold War in the term Third World, the unaligned nations. So we're kind of seeing this play out once again. And to take a line from Thomas 7.7, his viewpoint is that like the USG is only good at fighting the Cold War. So if you can identify things in a Cold War framework, if all you have is a hammer, then everything looks like a nail. So we'll continue to monitor these shifts, and trust me, I'm not going to just duck away from the subject. We will continue to monitor it. But secondly, is the issue of supply chains, food prices, and the delivery mechanisms. If there is someone who you need to follow or listen to, it is going to be Man Integrated on Twitter. That gentleman knows more about logistics than anyone else that I've met on Twitter. He's a fantastic guy to break things down. I mean, he is an American, but I mean, he can tell you just how fragile the supply chains are and what this means for the rest of the world in regards to grains and fertilizer, and how shipping has been affected in the last 2 years and now has been even more exacerbated by this conflict. He also writes about it on Substack at Fortis, Fortis, analysis. So he's really good to follow for this issue. And as he's made it very clear to me in his tweets and in replies, is that things are going to get a lot worse, especially when it comes to foreign aid like the World Food Program. So these delivery mechanisms and the already increased prices due to speculation, and then furthermore due to the fact that we don't know where future shipments may come down the line, or what the impact sanctions from the U.S. and other countries may be in these African states, that you will see famine potentially in about 6 months to a year when reserves run out. Unless, again, as I think King of Games had pointed out in the chat earlier today, that this may potentially be a way for sort of the American USA to sort of reshift its agricultural focus and move abroad. But then again, this is the same, USA and government that tried to get like soybeans to be planted in Afghanistan. So who knows? But again, the sanctions game can really only go so far in the midst of the U.S. regime's other geostrategic needs and interests. And we sort of touched base on this earlier when talking about India. Is that you can only go so far in relation to trying to punish Russia for its actions financially without openly declaring war, and waging and prosecuting an economic conflict that is only going to directly affect your geopolitical interests halfway across the world in, say, the South China Sea and your relationship with India and the Quad. There's already been talks about how this may affect the latest administration that has now been elected in South Korea. There's a really good article calling that was the incel election. And I think based off what I've read from the incoming South Korean president, it seems pretty interesting. Extending the work week and changing, HR rules and wanting nuclear weapons of their own, not being so dependent upon the Americans. So I think we'll talk a little more about that administration in the future because it seems interesting. But South Korea has been an area of interest as well because they've been trying to pressure the South Koreans to take more action on Taiwan. And now this ongoing sanctions regime has only made it more difficult because the Chinese do have some economic pressures, not to mention there's the proxy state of North Korea on the border in the DMZ. So I think that you can see how far the sanctions regime can go and how that can impact your geopolitical interests across the globe. But that, ladies and gentlemen, I think are going to be my conclusions here for what's happening. So yeah, and no one has that in the chat. So yeah, do follow Man Integrated for the issues that we're seeing in regards there. And I mean, the biggest issue, right, is going to be that sanctions do affect ordinary people. And if we've noticed our sanctions campaign since literally the 2000s on Iran, it does harden a population. It doesn't really do anything about, excuse me. It doesn't really do anything in relation to changing their position. It affects the citizenry. We watched for decades prior to the Iran nuclear deal, the Iranian people deal with double-digit inflation for like a decade, and they still maintained their positions. So something to just keep in mind in that area there. And we should be paying attention again to the BRIC countries and how the shipping lanes and wheat are going to play out in the near future. So again, those are the concluding thoughts to my lecture, but do stay because we have announcements, and I think everyone's favorite part because the viewer count always does jump up when we go to the Frog of the Week. But some announcements. So this is something that I'm going to float by to you guys, and I'm going to just bring this up in chat, and I hope that I can get your opinion on a few things here. This was a discussion I've been having with Turnip, and Apostolic Majesty was sort of the inspiration for this. But people always say that realist is sort of just a term that you use if you disagree with the administration on foreign policy. And that's not true. There are very specific doctrines to how realism works, how we view things. We don't ignore things like culture or ethnicity or language because nation states, while we view them as the primary actors, they have to work within the constraints of those factors of language, of energy, of topography, of geography, of their resources, of their ethnic makeup and languages of these populations in order to conduct a relationship to other countries. So those are things to keep in mind. And I thought about starting this sort of series of lectures on realist scholars. So it would be the same Sunday stream, but we would focus on one particular scholar. So, for instance, if we wanted to start with, say, modern realism, not the structural neo-realist stuff, we would start with, say, a lecture on Hans Morgenthau and politics among nations. And then sort of move our way up from there, talking about like Kenneth Waltz or talking about George Kennan and talking about John Mearsheimer. And each Sunday it would be a lecture on who they were and what their works were and things like that. And I want to make it clear about what realism actually is because there are critiques of it, and I think that those should be addressed. And at the same time, we also need to be looking at what the academic concept and what the theory actually means. So just let me know in the chat as well as the comments after the stream is done what you all think of that, because I do think that that's going to be important. And then secondly, I'll be starting to do more Odyssey exclusive videos in the future. We're going to start hopefully next week. I keep pushing it back because things keep coming up. But it's going to be on the fact that certain unvaccinated transplant patients are being denied organs. I went on a long rant about it on the Fed post, and y'all will hear it later. But it's something that's near and dear to my heart, obviously. You guys know. So that will come on Odyssey, because I'm not going to risk talking about that stuff on YouTube. But there'll be a Substack out later this evening, and this one will be a little less political, but just more about my observations when I drive on the road. I live in a very rural area, and part of my job, I drive across like 4 or 5 counties every Monday. And as the song from Simon and Garfunkel goes, you just get to watch America roll by. So hopefully you might just enjoy something that's more blog than just straight politics. That'll be out tonight. And then patrons, if you are a patron on my Subscribestar, you all have a link to view my speech from the U.S. Shieldings event. Some of you who were there, like Symbols, like Yiz, and Oros, had saw it live. But if you were wanting to know what I talked about, if you would like to see my speech, I got to watch it for myself. It was quite funny, and that's because I don't find myself to be a funny person, but people laugh. So hey, you all can even for just like $2 a month, you guys can see the speech and get access to videos early. So that'll be accessible there. For those asking about realism, we'll talk about both. So if you're interested in offensive and defensive, like we'll talk about Mearsheimer's idea of offensive realism, but we'll also talk about like Kenneth Waltz's idea of defensive realism in his seminal work, The International Theory of Politics. So we'll move in that direction. So trust me, we will. And then there'll be new merchandise on the merch store in the findmyfriends.net link below. So if you enjoy the ever so wonderful Frog of the Week mug, which I will show you all in just a minute, there'll be more stuff coming. And I got to thank Dora for making all that stuff. And then last but not least, I mentioned on the community tab that we're going to be doing a film review video, and it is not on any movie that any of you all are thinking. So I am reviewing, I'll be watching this Monday because I actually get to have a showing of it one time only, where I live, the 2021 film Man of God, about Saint Nectarios. So it'll be a really great time to actually watch like an Orthodox film and have his story being told on film. It'll be cool. And you'll all get a short review on that. Probably Wednesday or Thursday. I get to go to the movie theater this Monday. So those are all of my announcements. And, well, I think everyone's here for, I guess, the really fun part and the cozy part of the lecture. So here we go. Okay, so I thought that it would be fun to take a look sort of towards the Mediterranean and move towards the Italian pool frog, one of the many Italian water frogs in the area. So, of course, these are light green, yellowish fellows, sometimes with black spots, but it all depends on the content of the water, sort of its pH level, and where they live in their various islands and parts of Italy. They're light green, very smooth skin. They're not very warty, unlike some water frogs. And if they are from snout to rear end. They are, of course, about 3 inches in length. And to those of you who are new to this channel, we end every lecture with a frog of the week. So you end here with a little bit of information on IR, but you also get to learn about an amphibian. So um, here we go. And of course, the males have external vocal sacs for mating calls, and they are a northern Italian frog. So you can find them in places like Genoa, but they're also in places in the islands like Elba, Corsica, and they've been introduced to Sardinia. And they're listed under ICON, of course, as least concern. So their population is growing, and they're doing quite well with their various degrees of where they've been moving to. They're not yet listed as a invasive species, but they have the capacity to be one if they're introduced in certain areas. Monothalmos vocal sacs when they're mating calls, so their sacs will inflate and it'll have a very deep guttural croak that lasts anywhere from 1 to 3 seconds to reach out and find a mate. So this is the Italian pool frog. And this will get added to that wonderful Word document that Lance is one of my patrons has put together for me to make sure I don't do another frog in a row. These Italian pool frogs, they will put the frog heads of other species in a bed when they want to go to the mattresses. So keep that in mind. But they are a very Mediterranean monster. And Marcus, if you ever do see this, I think you'll appreciate it. But this is the frog of the week. So I think with that being said, we can just catch up on super chats and questions. And as always, thank you to my top tier patrons who donate $20 or more a month on Subscribestar. You wonderful gentlemen who are listed here do a great job of making sure my out-of-pocket costs for anti-rejection medication you keep it cheap, so you get to keep me focusing on that and things like that. So again, thank you so much. Let me go add myself to screen here real quick. Give me 1 second. Wonderful. So let's go change things up a bit, shall we? Okay, cool. So let me go check the studio because there were quite a few super chats that had came in here. So let's go there. And there's again, it's always good to have like about an hour-long lecture and then catch up with you guys for maybe 10, 15, 20 minutes and go from there. So let's see, go to monetization. I will have an entropy link eventually. I'm very bad at saying that I will do it and I need to. So we will begin. I'll just start here with the supers, and then this is my reminder. You will hold me to account, chat, if I don't have it out soon once it's all set up. So the first question that came in was from Bolero 393. He's been a really great supporter. Thank you so much. For $4.99 US, he says, PRU, P-R-U. I kind of like that. Do you think that the US will use food aid to reward strategic countries and or deny it to countries deviating from, say, the gays' anti-Russian policies? As I think King of Games had also asked that question early on, I think that he's got a very good point about that. And I think that considering that America does have a vast agricultural sector and how much subsidies are behind it, I do think that it's very possible for that to be used as a sort of geostrategic weapon of sorts to deal with food, as well as, funnel climate refugees potentially in a specific direction. But that's a good question. I do think that may be a potential avenue in the future. No Name asks anti-rejection medications. Have you had a transplant? Yes, I did. So a little over 9 months ago, I got a new kidney, and he keeps me going. So yeah, all of your your super chats, your Subscribestar money goes to paying off medical bills and keeping that medication cheap out of pocket, and I'm incredibly thankful for it. Some of the names in here, some of the chats kind of funny, like the pool's closed frog. I remember Habbo Hotel. To give away my age, I remember when all that happened. But let's see here. The other stuff that came in. This is from Oros Post. If you're not subscribing to his channel and if you're not following his project called paymyfriends.net that connects friendly based businesses and business owners to all sorts of services, whether it's lawyers, whether it's people with contracting and construction companies, go subscribe to him and go follow him. The guy's great, has a fantastic taste in music. He was my road trip buddy to the US event. Got to know him very well. He's a good friend. But he said at this time, I'm 15 minutes behind, but this is easily my favorite Sunday stream so far. Mad love for you, Prude Dude. Well, thank you so much, Oros. I'm very thankful. RCW for £5 British. Top Gear Sunday evening commentary. I can't do the sort of joke Top Gear intro, but one of these days I might do that as a joke for the Sunday stream. Like tonight on the Sunday stream, we'll just go over all sorts of crazy shit. And then last but not least, David White for £5 British. Thank you so much. Will Russia take out military aid with hypersonic missiles? So they did confirm that they are doing the used one. I think it's called the Dagger. I'm not sure what the actual name for it is, but it's called the Dagger. They did use it outside, I think, to bomb somewhere in Liev. So I think for me, it's a potential. I think using it once was deterrent enough because currently anti-ballistic missile technology from the West, I don't think is caught up to Mach 5 plus ballistic weaponry. So I think using it once was more than enough. But again, they have threatened to do exactly that, to target more arms shipments. So it's a potential, but I don't think that Russia wants to escalate it. Need is a different thing. And then last but not least came from Tuesday, who says, I got banned from DC's perspective the other day for dropping too many black pills. Specifically, I said MAGA needs to end. The dark MAGA thing. It feels almost as if we want to re-meme. And here, we'll just do this instead. It feels more like we're trying to meme 2016 aesthetics back into the real, which feels strange. I mean, we know that he's running again, but I just don't know. It kind of runs counterfactual or counterintuitive to what I advocate for, which is that there's more localism that should be focused on. I think the last election and the last 2 years with the COOF are very indicative to the fact that, hey, maybe national elections, they do kind of matter, but I'm not particularly ambitious about them. So I get it. But yeah, again, more localism. Let's see here. NPC 2749. Climate refugees. Can I use that as an excuse to move to the USA? I live in Canada. Fun fact, all three major parties have a lot of members of the World Economic Forum. Well, I think as Gio said, that you live in the first post-national country, and so do a few other good friends in our circles. God bless you. First of all, you're living in Canada, and so I sincerely hope that things improve. But I mean, hey, who knows? Just climate refugees. Things are getting too cold. Come move south. There'll be plenty of room for you here, I guess, because that seems to be U.S. policy, that the wide open doors. Although I think the best arguments against like mass immigration I've recently read came from like Philip Caffaro's book, who's like a dyed-in-the-wool liberal. About he wrote a book called "How Many Is Too Many." And that was a really good read about like anti-immigration policy from the left, which was just really strange about how just brutally honest it was. But like none of that stuff will ever get talked about because the ideology matters more than anything else. The political theology matters more than anything else, to take from Schmidt. But yeah, Glow in the Dark says the dark MAGA stuff is just funny in my opinion. Oh, I enjoy it. Don't get me wrong. I like some of the memes. I kind of like the ones where they just start photoshopping Trump images and they're in black or whatever, or they've done like various Sun and Rad edits. But I just don't see how we can repeat meme magic. It's not the same political environment as 2015 and 2016 was. So yeah. Oh yeah, he does call it the Prager Force. I kind of find that funny because he has no relationship to Prager University, but it is ideal. Apparently there's discussion about banning Russian or sanctioning Russian other agricultural products like chicken. If the tendies price jumps more than 70%, uh, they gave us chicken wings at the U.S. event, and I was very glad that they had bones in them because I thought it would be a little too on the nose if they just gave a bunch of tendies to a bunch of like right wingers at a conference. It'd just be too on the nose. But yeah. um you will have to search dark. It's literally just an aesthetic. That's all that this is. It's just basically Trump memes with laser eyes and dark black filters. So it's not really anything that you would need to be worried about. I just find it to be a meme more than anything. Oops. I'm not going to put that on screen, fellow, but I will answer your question. Do you think that sort of this empire aspect is, coming to an end as well as their cancerous woke ideology, or is this only the beginning for them? In conversations I've had with Paul Fahrenheit and others, I don't think that it's going to end anytime soon. It will be here as long as it wants to be here. That doesn't mean it won't take L's or it may have to retrench, but I don't think that it will outright disappear or collapse. Keep in mind, and this is sort of the neo-reactionary perspective, is that the left thrives and dies, or the left thrives on dialectics. They love it when the ideology clashes and there's this amalgamation of contradiction, because that gives you a vacuum to pursue power and to attain it. And then secondly, whereas the right dies by it, right? But the other thing is that they may retrench, they may have to move back, but that doesn't necessarily mean that things are going to change anytime soon. They may take, of course, a loss, but I don't think that the ideology will eat them alive yet. So things to keep in mind there. But as for all of that, thank you all once again for tuning in this Sunday. And what I will do real quick is share this tab instead, so you all can get a closer look at here. Share this tab real quick. So we have this one. This is the subscribe star link in the description. You guys, again, can support there. If you want to just join for free, that way you can get tips, or maybe when I'm going to take a break or a day off or something, that's what you can do. So I highly recommend that you join there. The smallest price, of course, they're all based on frogs. Smallest one is the tadpole tier. Got a little Pepe there. Full access, early access, and you can join patron streams and hangouts, various movies nights that we've done. We've seen quite a few movies now, and we'll do more. So, and you guys get suggestions and access to the Discord server that are for patrons. And the biggest thing starting in April is that my patrons and I are going to start a book club, and we'll be reviewing Paul Gottfried's After Liberalism. So I'll be reading it together. I'll be taking my notes in with them, and we'll do a video on it. So things are going to be great. And Mark Doppelganger is providing links to Man Integrated for greater logistical and shipping lane analysis. So all of you wonderful gentlemen, I hope that you have a fantastic rest of your Sunday, whether it's the morning, the evening, or the afternoon. Take care, God bless, and be prudent. We'll see you all next time.